This is my windlass rebuild. It is a quick 1000, a bit of a mongrel because it's actually got a Viewer 1200 watt motor on it. Anyway, this is the gypsy being pulled off to get into it with a hammer, and once you've undone the nut at the top. Next bit is there's a washer just below this. Just prise the washer off. Well, it's actually a little cone shaped thing that forms a clutch. And here's the first bit, it's the seal. My favourite way of getting a seal out, an old seal out, if you don't want to use it again, drill a hole, stick a screw in it, and then just get onto it with a claw hammer, pull it out, get rid of it. Below that you've got a circlip and a bearing. This is where I had a bit of fun with the windlass. The didn't want to come out, so the bearing had disintegrated anyway, so I pulled the shaft out and then just proceeded to bash the last parts of the bearing out. That wasn't going to come out real easily either, so I got a feeling I had to pull the circlip out first, but anyway. Probably part of the centre of the bearing coming out there. It's coming out bit by bit. Just using a punch here to just get on the very edges of the outer shell. It's a lot easier to get a bearing out if it's intact, but unfortunately it wasn't the case with this one. There it is, out. Here's the inner part of the bearing, and it's held on to the shaft by a circlip. I don't even have the right circuit pliers here. This need the ones to open up a circlip, not close it, but anyway, you work with what you've got. Prise it off whatever way you can. After you got the circlip off, you can get the centre of the bearing. So here's the gearbox, and it is not in great condition. Probably arguable whether I should have even bothered rebuilding this, but I decided to go ahead with it because we had a trip coming up, and I figured it was the motor is running, the gearbox is still working. It was going pretty slow, and you can sort of see there where there's a bit of corrosion around the seals, a lot of corrosion around the seals. And that was largely because of water. A lot of water had been coming down through below the gypsy because the seal and the bearing were shot, and that was letting water down into the gearbox, and that found its way through the gearbox and let the oil out of the gearbox, which you'll find later. Anyway, we got these bolts to get undone, and they're proving a bit problematic. You get them part way out, and then my favourite stuff's this can of what's it called, H72 redactor. That works pretty well on stainless into aluminium. There's a plug at the end of the gearbox, and When you undo this plug, you're supposed to find the gearbox is full of oil, and this one is dry, completely dry. This is where the problems all started from, and the oil log gone. There's no trace of oil in my below the windlass in the where the anchor chain goes. So this had been operating without oil for quite some time. Anyway, we just sit there and with a soft-ended hammer and just smash the gearbox apart. Eventually comes apart. Once the bolts are out, I just ran them through I can't remember, it was a 6 or 8mm die, and just cleaned them up, cleaned all the aluminium off them, so that they'd go back in a bit better when it comes time to reassembly. There you have it. Look at the state of those bearings. Wonderful. Yeah, almost completely seized up, these ones. The one that's around just below the gypsy was completely knackered as well, and that's the other half of the bearing. So it's not looking real well. If it don't come apart, get a bigger hammer. There it is. So you measure up the bearings, 68 or something like that, and 40mm on the inside. They are pretty standard bearing. You can go down the bearing shop and buy them, and they're both the same size from memory. And now the next fun bit's getting them off the gear. There's been water on this. That worm wheel there is made of steel, and it was starting to go rusty, and it was starting to chew some of the bronze worm gear off, but it still usable. So I decided at this point that I'd go ahead with the rebuild and clean it up. So that's your seal. And then inside of that, this is where the motor goes onto. There's another little snap ring in there, which you've squeeze and remove, and then you've got to get the shaft and its bearings out. That proved to be a bit of fun. So put a screwdriver down inside the thing and try to tap it out. So to get a bit more clearance, I've put it on top of the other half of the gearbox. And there it is. Except one bearing is still inside the housing. I don't think those bearings are much good either. They were pretty rusty as well, as you can see. Getting the shaft out through this bearings wasn't a big problem, as you can see. So I'm putting the shaft back in and trying to dislodge the bearing that's stuck in the blind end of the hole there. So I'm just trying to get the bearing to loosen up a bit and get it out of the housing, because it's a pretty difficult job getting a bearing out of a housing. So. Trying anything at this stage, trying to get that bearing out, levering it out. It did eventually come out, knocking it back, so it's moving but it's not getting out far enough, so I'm sort of wriggling it back and forward, trying to get it to free up a bit. Okay. This is a seal, just an oil seal inside the end of the housing. There's one in each side of it, so this is the other one of it. So here we're getting the bearings off the each side of the gear, the worm gear, and they're moving fairly freely, so you can actually see there I've managed to move it quite a bit just by lifting it off, levering it off with a screwdriver, so that's going to be a pretty easy job. I'm trying a few things out here to lever it off, but really when it comes down to it, there's nothing like getting onto a bearing puller and just putting that onto it. So socket set, just a tiny bit smaller than the inside of the bearing. Put a bolt down the middle of it to plug up the hole, and then a 3-jaw puller. A bearing press would be nice, but I don't own one. So there it all is. The other bearing's already off now, and now's the job of cleaning up some of the bits. So just using a wire wheel in the end of the drill, and I just run over the worm drive there. Make sure it's nice and smooth and doesn't sort of chew the bronze gear to bits. So that surface is where the bearings go back on, so it reassembles better. And clean up the bronze gear and make sure it's nice and shiny. Okay, I've been down to the bearing place and I've got a whole lot of new seals and bearings and what have you. They're just standard off-the-shelf bits. You take down your old parts and take all the parts. Just take the bearings, take the actual shafts and housings, and they'll measure those up and get your bearings to match. I'm putting a bit of Permatex on it just to sort of protect the aluminium and stop any further corrosion on. Gently push the bearings back on. Actually, went on reasonably easily. And put the whole thing back in the assembly, back into the casing. Bit of fun and games working out which way it goes in best. So you've got to wind the worm wheel around to get the whole thing to line up. Give everything a good coating of grease. to help protect it. In fact, rather than fill this gearbox with oil, because it had so much corrosion on it, would have leaked out, I ended up filling the whole gearbox with grease, marine grease, and put it back together full of grease. Bit of added protection just in case there's any water gets down into this part of the housing, because there's actually a drain hole, and so I filled it up to the drain hole with some waterproof compound. It's Permatex 3, I believe. Giving the housing a bit of a clean and a grease before it goes to reassembly. And this is a bearing for the Gypsy, so you can see there I've just popped the side off the bearing, the seal, rubber seal off the bearing, and packing the whole bearing full of grease, then putting the seal back in. I do this just in case any water gets down past the shaft. It'll sort of help the bearing last a bit longer by keeping the water out, displacing the water. A bit of mucking around, you eventually slide the bearing back down, and then there's a circlip locates it all in place. Get all your surfaces a coating of grease. Just looking for something about the same size as the outside of the bearing. Anything will do. Circle it back in place to hold the bearing in place. Bit more grease. And then put the seal in place. The grease also helps the seal stay in good condition too, by providing extra lubrication, because it's a pretty hostile environment there. So this is a clutch. Little spacer goes on first, and then there's a cone, and then the Gypsy wheel. There you go, test run. Test it in both directions.